welcome to the transport seminar at McGill. It's very nice to bring a familiar face to me, and I'm happy to have Lake. She's a Canadian journalist, poet, writer, urban planner, and the list can keep going for a long thing. She's an award-winning journalist and for some of her writing, and I know her mostly based on her amazing work and research in cycling and her major work and the things she achieved in cycling in Chile over I don't know how many years. I've been following Lake's work in Chile for a while. She has a PhD from University of Toronto, but she lives in Chile and she has been doing a lot of on the ground work on cycling that is like really amazing, and we all learned from her work on the ground. Thanks, Lake, for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. It's wonderful to get back together, or even in these difficult conditions, and it's a great honor and a pleasure to be included in this series. I've enjoyed all of the talks so far that I've been able to attend, and they've had a really special flavor to them, which I tried to continue with this presentation as well. So yes, I'm going to talk about cycle inclusive planning as they relate to social inclusion and social justice, transport justice, as Carol Martins has put it. And but I'm going to talk about, we tend to talk about cycling a lot from the perspective of cyclists who demand it, and they are a wonderful social movement and all over the world. There's no doubt about that. But I like to kind of take an approach to cycling from different perspectives, more rooted in planning than elsewhere. So I have a very small laboratory for social change, which is a collaboration between the Catholic University of Chile, Transport Engineering, the Center for Excellence in BRT+, and the Center for Sustainable Urban Development. And but we partner directly and in a power sharing way with some of the leading citizen organizations. So what we're always looking for is ways to answer the question of, how do we change? How do we get to where we need to go to have sustainable transportation or transport justice or inclusive mobilities? And it's been a long roundabout, but very, very interesting journey. And I really like the idea of this presentation as an opportunity to share it. So as have the other presenters done, what I've sort of done is, there's a lot of research and it's been published in very, very serious journals that have certainly made a great contribution to these kinds of research and these processes of seeking ways of creating change. But mostly I'm going to just take you through the reflections about this. What does this mean? How can we put it to work? How do we really influence public policy? Because you can see that if the traditional methods of putting up posters or educating supposedly the empty heads of people, ordinary people, if those kinds of approaches worked, we'd be living in a very different world, and we're not. So that's part of the challenge that I take on. So I think it's important to start, I think it's often between the lines, but I like to make it explicit with automobility. And then we've taken gender as a very useful proxy for looking at social exclusion, inclusion, looking at discrimination, looking at power imbalances and so on. Because unlike other differences, actually gender discrimination is virtually universal, sadly. But as researchers, it does give us insight and it allows us to collaborate with colleagues around the world. So I then look at sustainable transport rather than as one mode versus the unsustainable transport of automobility as an ecology of modes and users, and going on to a few more contemporary things. So first of all, I'd like to say that I've lived in Chile for 40 years. I was born and grew up in Canada. I love both countries. I would be very challenged if I had to choose between them. They're very complementary in many ways. Canada is long and wide, and Chile is long and narrow from north to south, many climate zones, etc. We're quite resource dependent, both countries, and very similar resources, forestry, fisheries, etc. So we're very, very vulnerable to climate change and crises and loss of biodiversity and so on. But there are some very, very important differences in Chile, as in many countries of Latin America. We had a military regime for 17 and a half years, and we continue to live in an extremely authoritarian political and institutional system. Even by Latin American standards, Chile and Brazil are the two most unequal countries in the continent, and we usually rank up with the top 10 most unequal countries in the world. So some things that sound similar actually play out in more extreme ways. So for example, for transportation, even compared to Mexico or Bolivia or other countries, we remain very centralized. And so it's the National Transportation Ministry that plans Santiago's transport system, which is really crazy. It's not something a national government can do well. And Chile's certainly the living example of that, for better or for worse. So I mentioned inequalities, and I just want to really spell it out, because although our streets are full of cars and it looks like everyone has one, in fact, car ownership is very concentrated in the wealthy area of the city, as you can see in the bottom right-hand map. And in fact, some families have 4 or 5 cars. And so it's not that cars average over the population. And in fact, if you look at this map, which separates Santiago into its municipal jurisdictions called comunas, you can see that cars are only the majority in 3 or 4 comunas. And actually walking is the majority, accounts for the majority of daily trips in a good part of the city, which is obviously very low income parts of the city. And of those people who walk, women are a very high percentage. So that brings up some of the contradictions between social and energy or environmental sustainability. So spending has reinforced the inequalities over the years. A lot of money has gone into highway concessions that don't even serve all car drivers in the cities in the city where they've been installed. And a lot of money's gone into metro, which is really hard, underground subway trains, which is kind of hard to understand when BRT, bus rapid transit and corridors can offer such great benefits for much less. So just to remind ourselves that unsustainable transport is automobility. It's been really, really well formulated, very thoroughly in sociology by Beckman, Urey, Scheller, and Urey over the past 2 decades. And so this focus on cars as the center of urban planning reflects cars as an industry, but also as a financial product. Loans to buy cars are the second most important product sold by banks. So in Latin America, it's common to see banks offering deals subsidizing the cost of your gasoline and that kind of thing. It's also a culture and a way of life. We've been sold a bill of goods that it's the way to get ahead, that if you don't have a car, then you're just this poor, marginalized person, usually a guy. And so it's had decades of very, very intense publicity to sell it, very similar to cigarettes. And of course, what it means in Latin America, as it does all over the world, and particularly in cities and countries in the global south, is a lot of people die. A lot of people who don't need to die. And in our case, very little is done about it. In theory, we have a zero collision, zero death policy, but in reality, we don't. And just to say that streets are very important spaces for work, for art, for recyclers, for cycle taxis or rickshaws, as they're called in India. And the monopolization of our streets, as in North America, has really placed our health much more at risk. And what that means in a country like Chile, where very few people have access to complete healthcare, is that we're extremely vulnerable because of lack of physical activity, air pollution, etc. So I always say that, and I think sooner or later someone's going to take me up on this, that the public health lobby should really be demanding a warning on the car, so that every time you open the door, there's a little label there that tells you what it's doing to your children's development, your health, your lifespan, your probabilities of ending up with diabetes 2, etc. So more than ever, when we start looking at these issues, gender begins to become very powerful as a way of understanding inequities in the system, lacks within the system, but also opportunities for change and demands for change as well. So we started a few years back, a group of us at the university and also with community organizations, saying, well, wait a minute, we know what environmental sustainability is, its limits. We know what economic sustainability is. There's a lot of different definitions, but they seem kind of worked out and clear. But social sustainability didn't seem so clear. So I sat down with a group of really wonderful scholars, starting with Mike Riplogel in the 1990s. He's always been such a pioneer, that fellow. And then David Bannister, who opened this series, and others as well, and really looked at, you know, the health impacts, but also the moral values, the cultures that are involved in how we live and whether we live more or less sustainability. And then also rights, participation, and governance, because there's very little about that in sustainability. And actually, power is very important, and power inequalities are very central to why we progress in some places and we don't progress in others. So we've done quite a bit of work on gender, both surveys but also interventions, on-street walking, audits that have been developed by women's groups in Toronto and elsewhere around the world. We started with what we thought would be a nice Safe Routes to School program, and because we use participatory action research, the students immediately said, we don't want safe routes, we want cool routes, and we want this and we want that. And so we took them up on their ideas, and our program really expanded in a great many unexpected ways. And particularly, we also look a lot at public transport and what it means and how it works with the children when we can go to school, which of course has not been possible for a while. So I don't expect you to read all this, but just to know that we did this analysis of where people walk, and particularly where women walk. And if you only look at numbers, then you think, oh, wow, women are so sustainable. Isn't this wonderful? They account for 80% of sustainable transport trips in many of the municipal areas of metropolitan Santiago. And of course, the problem is that means their access to the city is actually very limited. And although they're well over half of public transport users, there are no safety concerns or measures taken to make them safer on their travel. And finally, we started using this concept developed by Inés Sánchez de Madariaga in Spain, of grouping together shopping and escorting trips and health-related or red tape-related trips as care trips. And we found that indeed women make up to 3 times as many of those trips and often twice as many of those trips as men. But we also were quite surprised when we discovered that this is the biggest single category of trips in metropolitan Santiago. So almost half of daily trips during the work week are for care-related activities and are made mostly by women. And that's almost 10% more than work-related and almost 5 times more than study-related trips. So this has really powerful implications for how to resolve a lot of sustainable transport conundrums, because what it means, for example, is land use becomes very important. Unlike most Canadian cities, young children don't go to schools in their own neighborhood because our cities are so segregated. The good schools are in the rich neighborhood or 3 or 4 neighborhoods, and the rest try and ship their kids across the city. And so they generate a lot of trips. And of course, with COVID and other social disruptions, that becomes, that makes functioning impossible. So I started to think about sustainable transport rather than trying to think, oh, replace it with walking or replace it with cycling or replace it with public transport, as an ecology of modes, and taking into consideration as well that we're not just talking about transport modes and the way they move through the city, that is flows. We're talking about how they impact on social spaces. And of course, I think we all know Donald Appleyard's pioneering work on livable streets. And yet, what, 40, 50 years later, we still haven't really put that knowledge to use in the way we design our neighborhoods. And so these are pictures from Sao Paulo about how this sociability of transport nodes and spaces plays out, and how important they are to work, to play, to survival for a lot of people. So again, roads as spaces for art, work, and services are very important. And finally, as well, where we learn citizenship and where we exercise it. These are social and political aspects of our roads and our transport systems, which we tend to leave out when we're planning. And that, I think, is a serious problem. So when we started working this out, and we realized that if we think about sustainable transport as an ecology of modes as kind of niches, and the users as the people who occupy those niches and move between niches as well and are interrelated and so on, the lower the density and the longer the distance, it's obvious that in the very extreme sense, very low density and so on, and very long distances, cars make sense. For example, in a rural context where farmers are taking their produce to markets or whatever. But for the rest of us, in our cities in Latin America have very good densities, walking is really the mode that we should be encouraging with our designs and our policies from 0 to 2, and cycling being the bridge mode between walking and buses, because you can, or public transport. I'm going to talk mostly about buses because very few cities actually have metros. In Chile, 3 have very limited metros. So this gives you a bit of an ecology of modes and their respective users, and gives you a way of also setting planning goals, so that if we know that that's our ecology, then we want to set up land use. And actually, local governments have a lot more authority over where a corner store goes, or where schools go, or where community gardens, kitchen gardens go, or primary health service goes, than over where jobs go. So a lot of the efforts to make residential areas coincide with work have failed, because it's very hard to control where working opportunities end up concentrated. But these kinds of social services, which again are very important, particularly to women because of their care activities, are much easier for governments, local governments, to manage and to actually plan for. And so we continued to go through this. And I did this a lot with a colleague from India, because when I went to India, I went to Delhi in 2012 and traveled around quite a bit, did some of the tourist sites, but mostly also looked a lot at recyclers and at transportation. And the thing that really struck me and that I took away from that experience, it was quite a life-changing experience, was this sense that there was a real ecology, a transportation ecology of different modes. And I'm not saying that it was all good. It's not all good. The road safety is terrible, etc. And inequalities are really terrible as well. but it was a very rich ecology. There were so many different kinds of vehicles. There were cycle rickshaws, there were gas rickshaws, the way motorcycles are used, which of course is problematic for pollution and for road safety. But actually there's so much talk about electrification, and people are only electrifying cars and very little electrification of motorcycles, which are actually much more accessible and much more important vehicles for work and for vital social and work-related and other functions for people. It's quite, it says a lot about our blind spots in planning, and those blind spots are not really accidental. They reflect inequalities and the invisibilization of important groups within our society, majority groups in the global South. So again, in Canada, when I was growing up, it was, I think it's changed quite a lot, but it was people who were really, really poor, low income were a minority. In Chile and India and other countries, they're actually the majority. And that changes a lot of things when you're reading reality or looking at modes. So we started to think about target modes for these different target modal shares for different modes. And with Alex Carner, who's an American researcher who came out of San Francisco with a real strong interest in social justice, we were able to collaborate on looking at, car trips in metropolitan San Francisco, the Bay Area, and in metropolitan Santiago. And as you can see, one thing is that car use is really much smaller, even though it dominates our roads. But also the green is, these are all car trips. The green trips are car trips that would be best done walking because they're under 2 kilometers. That's an awful lot of trips, very short trips that are being made by car. And of course that reflects urban designs, but also value systems that perpetuate that you should arrive in a car and then you're really with it. And similar to biking as well. So, which is the orange section. And then the purple ones are longer trips over 5 kilometers that you would figure could. So we started, we were really, when we looked at it in percentages, up to well over half and up to 3/4 of car trips in both cities were below 5 kilometers. So kind of crazy, inefficient from an economic, from an environmental, but also a social perspective to be making those trips and planning roads for those kinds of trips as well. And it would be interesting if this were repeated elsewhere to see, because what was kind of strange and surprising to us was, given how different the two cities are, how similar these breakdowns of figures. So it would be interesting to see if that kind of plays out. So what we took these figures and we translated them into what would be could be a target modal share, so that if you actually took all the trips under, in this case, 8 kilometers, which is also cyclable in about 15 to 20 minutes. If you took those out of cars and spread them out among walking when they're under 2 kilometers and on bikes or different kinds of bikes, when they're under 8 kilometers, you actually end up with about 13% of trips should remain in cars or some kind of similar motor vehicle. And again, it was a bit surprising how similar some of those figures were, because also we discovered that public transport trips as well, quite a few of those are cover very short distances, which probably in North America is not such an issue because public transport is a minority mode. But in developing cities, public transport moves the masses. It moves millions and millions of people every day. And we actually have a huge, even before COVID-19, we had a huge problem with overcrowding on our buses and metro systems where metro systems exist. So having really effective mechanisms to get people out of cars, but also out of public transport, to reduce the overcrowding and so on, and getting them out walking and cycling according to the distance opens itself up as a really interesting way of structuring transitions toward a newer, more sustainable kind of city, starting from where they are. So based on this, we moved away from multimodality as a term. Every city has some level of multimodality. There's lots of different kinds of transport, more in some sectors than others. And again, that reflects certain social injustices. But we really started to focus on intermodality, which is usually used as a term within freight and logistics and so on. But in this case, we're talking about people being able to live car-free without sacrificing quality of life, understood as access to the benefits and the wonders of their cities and also the nature within their cities or around their cities or whatever. So we really started to look at intermodality as kind of seamless integration of these different modes and in our case, sustainable modes. And actually, there's a lot of these systems exist. There's bike parking at train stations and in different cities. There's bike racks on buses in virtually all cities in Canada and the United States now. Bikes on trains, because trains are much more common public transport mode in Europe. Bike rentals associated with train and bus hubs. Public bike share, which has swept the world and really done a great deal for opening eyes to how important cycling can be. But public bike share with integration into public transport fares remains unusual. Unfortunately, there's been really successful experiments in Seville, but not a lot of other places. But then there's also cycle routes connecting stations and bus stops and really getting the most out of the different intermodal options, and cycle taxis as well. So when I talk about cycling as kind of a missing link in sustainability, I'm not just talking about an individual bicycle that a person owns or borrows from a bike share program. I'm talking about cycle taxis that can help women with 3 kids and all the groceries for the month move from the metro station half a kilometer or a kilometer away to her house without having to manage or indeed place in danger on dangerous roads her children, and therefore can live more comfortably and do things more efficiently. So this brings us to a really important shift in the way we think about cycling. And I think that cycling advocacy has really achieved a miracle. In fact, I started getting involved in these issues in the late 1990s when we were fighting a highway project that was going to destroy our neighborhood in Santiago. And at that time, it was like, highways are highways. What else is there? And certainly cycling advocacy played a huge role in putting cycling back on the agenda. And it's very interesting to contrast the amount of resources that were put into selling bus rapid transit, which is a technology and a strategy which I'm very fond of. But I have to be critical because, you know, we had the World Bank and Enrique Peñalosa touring the world for many years with all kinds of resources put into selling this, and a lot of cities have taken it up, but it hasn't won the hearts and minds of users. And in the meantime, cycling, which has received virtually zero funding from the World Bank or any significant international institution, is thriving, and it's growing by leaps and bounds in cities where even 10 years ago, it seemed impossible that you could even ride half a kilometer or a kilometer on congested or very high speed roads, which are very typical. So we started using this term cycle inclusion, which was coined by the Dutch as their strategy for bringing cycling into planning, into land use planning, into heritage planning, into social planning, and into planning their roads and their transport systems. But what we found in Latin America, and I guess, and this comes back to our inequalities, is how important it is. That whole idea of inclusion is so important to including people who have disabilities associated with mobility, as this fellow in Seville, or in southern Chile, in Temuco as well. We work with several people with physical disabilities, and they talk about how important even the rather limited and not great quality cycleways that have gone in, how important they've been to giving them a minimum route to get around the city. And I think that's really important because roads are really racetracks in many ways, and in many cultural and social imaginary spaces. You get in your car and you go, and we teach children that from very small, particularly boys. There's a psychological and a sociological aspect to what we do that's very, very troubling. And we really don't want cycleways of whatever kind of cycleway it is, fully segregated, visually segregated, a shared road, or any other kind of facility, traffic calming, etc. We really want all users to understand that we're going for inclusion here. And therefore we need to build for different speeds, different capacities right from the start. And also for different social functions. This is a recycler in Delhi who I spent kind of a wonderful morning with, talking to him about how he does his work and so on, and watching how he did it. And we have these same recyclers with tricycles in Santiago and all over Latin America. They play a very important role in recycling and therefore in urban sustainability. But our cycleways aren't made for them. And then there's also these adapted bikes, which have become very, very common around the world. They've even started to appear in Santiago, which always surprises me. And also tandems, which permit people who are visually impaired to enjoy cycling, perhaps more as a recreational activity. I don't know enough about that to give an opinion. And for work, and I actually tried out a rickshaw, and they're incredibly hard to ride or drive. So there's definitely space for engineers to help overcome that left pull that they have, because it really is quite delicate. And for those who have their doubts about the capacities, I think bikes have their limits, but they go way beyond what we in the first world or developed countries tend to imagine. They can really do a lot. And there also are people like this fellow in India, Pradeep Kumar, who's a fellow from Ashoka, an international network of social entrepreneurs who have really changed the business model behind rickshaws and cycle taxis and cycle cargo and so on, and started to create very much more inclusive business models for some of these services. So we're all pretty familiar with this reverse traffic pyramid that first came out of the Bicycle Innovation Lab in Denmark a few years back. It was their idea of a Christmas present to the world, which I thought was lovely. And then these strategies developed by Jen Gell in New York and applied a lot around the world, and starting to imagine these kinds of techniques. We're now having a lot of fun talking about whether complete streets is the right name, is it the right concept for our very different urban imaginaries in Latin America. So I think in about 6 to 8 months, we'll start having some articles about that based on that. So the other thing we've done, and I said this at the beginning, we look at all these issues, and I think theoretical development like this is really important. It's really important to understand that we shouldn't just be thinking about adding a cycle lane here or a cycle lane there. We should really be thinking about integral solutions for our cities. But above all, we need to think about how to get there. And it's very clear that a big part of the problem is political systems, which may be more or less democratic, depending on where you live, but aren't democratic enough to really address some of the major issues and challenges facing our cities and our societies around the world today. So we borrowed from the Copenhagenize and the American cycle movements and other, Copenhagen also does their cycle city rankings and so on, and also from another initiative to generate impacts on the political world called Bogotá Como Vamos, which has spread over the past 20 years all over Latin America. But we took these experiences and we put them into developing a transport justice balance sheet. and started, that took us 3 years. It was very multidisciplinary and very multi-method. We had 2 wonderful transport surveys in 2 very contrasting cities, Temuco, and which is more of a rural city with a very high percentage of indigenous people and communities around it. And then also Santiago, this huge metropolitan region that holds 40% of the population of Chile. But we spent a lot of time exploring what it really meant. What was equality? What was equity? We looked at these contributions from civil society that really challenge our basic assumptions. And every time you think you've kind of got to a solution, you realize, we could think outside this box too. We're in a series of boxes, and we need to think outside each one of them. And in the end, we had 25 researchers from 5 universities, 7 of the top citizen organizations, the 2 cities that I mentioned. And we produced a 48-page report that, yes, measured, evaluated using qualitative and quantitative indicators, road safety, gender violence as associated with public transport, and so on. But also, we discovered that parking was destroying heritage and destroying walkable neighborhoods, and that doesn't really appear in other formulations of transport justice. So it opened our eyes to a lot of things, and we realized that transportation, because the transport systems are everywhere, they can also be powerful instruments for change. So what we're doing now is we're doing a ranking of 20 to 25 Chilean cities, mostly small and medium-sized cities, which of course are the cities that are the home to most of the world's population. These mega cities are very dramatic and very challenging, but most people continue to live in small and mid-sized cities. And we're using a very simple Delphi panel survey method to evaluate these cities for transport justice. And what's really neat about this is, aside from the fact that people are loving it and they're really participating, and our very centralized city, it's a very centralized country where Santiago is virtually the synonym for Chile, and it's not in reality, but it is in discourse. All of a sudden, we're talking about everywhere but Santiago, and we're looking at really major progress that's been made in smaller cities like Rancagua, just to the south, which is seldom held up as an example of great cycling and walking inclusive urban planning, a bit like Montreal that doesn't get mentioned up there with the big sexy cities, and yet it's just kind of quietly doing a lot of things really well. So I don't want to go on too long about this, but just to say that out of this ranking, which we expect to have done November, December, will come a citizens' agenda, a series of demands or proposals for what we want candidates in the municipal elections next year to buy into and to commit to and to support. And then when those candidates from different parties win, then we have indicators based on this agenda and the ranking to evaluate how well they're really doing their job. So we hope to get away from this horrible, horrible political atmosphere that's either based on clientelism, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, but then you have to buy into everything I say, no matter how good or bad it is, or you have to be a party member to have influence, when most citizens aren't party members, but do need to influence the public agenda. And where particularly today, where we're facing such polarization in discourse, we really need intermediate discourses about what's good for us, and they need to have credibility, and therefore they need to have relationships, and they need to have evidence to support them. So that's what we're doing. And within this, I'll just spend the last couple of minutes now on challenges and opportunities related to COVID. So this is my neighborhood in Santiago. This may be familiar to many of you. The bars are open and the parks are closed. Our children, our older adults, they have no place to play. They come out at night like vampires and they sneak around, especially when we are in full quarantine. Now we're supposedly allowed out, although it's still very dangerous and very little has been done. And so we've also started this experiment at the neighborhood level to create a street plan that's led by the neighborhood association, because our political authorities are too busy dealing with opening bars and so on to open our streets for open street initiatives so that neighbors can get out and walk around with their masks, with social distancing, but in an environment that's safe and that's friendly and that resumes the social ties that people are missing. So also we are calling for the return of our Open Streets initiative and for its expansion way beyond just the Sunday open street event, but we want it on weekdays. We want it to facilitate travel to shopping, movement through shopping areas, because they need to do it out in the open air. We think we could be having open air schools on neighborhood streets. We have a much better climate than Canada. I have to say, I think about Canada and I think, oh, this is a much harder problem there. Generate programs like Cycling Without Age from Denmark, where they take older adults out on tricycles and drive them around, or take them to vote in elections, but they don't have to get into a car, they don't have to risk their health, and so on. And really provide very substantial support to bike messengers and cycle taxis, and to encourage a shift from diesel to electric motors to assist them. So those are some of the things we're looking at, to go beyond cycleways to more strategic plans and networks. And the last image I'd like to share with you is this one that was probably the most surprising result of this very open-ended collaboration that we did for our transport justice report, because really it suggests that wicked problems can actually have wicked solutions. So we started talking to colleagues who work in ecosystems and ecosystem services about how we could collaborate more and so on. And Erika Alvarez from Temuco came up with this amazing map of the patterns of wetlands and urban rivers in Temuco, and how they could be used as the basis for a walking and cycling network throughout the region. And I think more and more, that's the big challenge we have, is to not plan one solution at a time, but to find ways to bundle together ecosystems, walking, cycling, and really good public transport connections, and really start reconquering our streets much more quickly. We know how to do this. We've been rehearsing it for years all over the world. So this is my thanks. Ahmed gave me a lot of credit at the beginning, but actually, as you can see, there's a great many people who add their 2 cents to this and say, Lake, I don't think you're right about that, and correct a lot of errors and contribute in many important ways to this kind of research. So thank you very much for your interest, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, there's a lot of questions.
Oh my goodness.
There's a lot of questions. So thanks, Lake. It's so engaging and like, okay, so people have to forgive me. I'm gonna be, Jamie's helping me and we're picking some of the questions as we go because there's a lot.
Okay,
so I'll start with Antonio Tagle. He's a former student. I think you know him, maybe. Would you say there have been significant improvements regarding both intermodality and traffic justice in the last few years in Santiago and the rest of Chile?
Well, I would say mainly no, and some yes, huh? And that is where the institutional straitjacket inherited from the military regime has really, really blocked a lot of change. Just to give one example, tactical urbanism, which is a strategy that was invented by citizen organizations to push their municipal governments to move more quickly in North America, is actually being practiced by a lot of small city planning offices, Santiago, downtown Santiago, Providencia, which have led on walkability and cycle inclusion for the past 20 years, but they're really, really tied down by these institutional limits, so that suddenly the National Ministry of Transport, which has no competence in cycle inclusive urban planning or design, steps in and prohibits something, or forces local planners to use a really bad design that's really dangerous and that is not going to be a major contribution. On the other hand, you have cities, and again, this is why small and medium-sized cities are so interesting, because they can really leap ahead. They don't have the same kind of constraints as a big metropolitan region does. And so Rancagua, which is a much smaller city, has just gone nuts. It's just amazing what they've done. Very similar to the kinds of modest but very significant changes that Montreal has lived through for many, many years. But Rancagua's done it the last few years. So when the COVID emergency hit, they just sped up everything, and they've done an amazing job. And they're probably one of the most walkable, cycling inclusive cities in Latin America now. Santiago, however, has lagged behind. Not everyone wants it to move ahead, except the national authorities, who remain very wedded to car-oriented planning and investment.
Okay. Manuela from McGill here is asking you about how does the real or perceived safety violence risks intersect with promoting sustainable modes in Chile? So how much of the risks do you think is like real and how much is perceived and in Chile based on your experiences and talking to people on the streets and seeing the realities that's happening?
Well, I'm very reluctant to make a very sharp distinction between perceived risks and so-called measurable risks or physical risks, partly because the perception of risk, for example, in the case of gender violence against women, you perceive risks in certain situations, certain places, from certain kinds of individuals, or at certain times of day, and therefore you avoid them. So it's not really realistic or objective to say that, oh, these women perceive risks here, but there are no crimes there, if you see what I mean. So I think that's an important point. These realities co-constitute each other. You can't really say it's all in your head. So on that note, people, I think, are very realistic about the risks. We've had 7 cyclists and at least 1 pedestrian that I've heard about die in the past week. And that is, and we have more than 2,000 cyclists die every year. Maybe it's people, because I don't spend a lot of time with road safety figures, but it's really high. Like I remember Toronto was in a total kerfuffle about the high rate of pedestrians being run over and cyclists. And I looked it up and it was like 5 cyclists. I'm like, 5? They're upset about 5. We've got 1,000 and no one's getting upset, just us cyclists. And road safety is a major problem. And of course, with the emptier roads, speeds have really gone up. And although a really broad coalition of academics and advocates and other kinds of experts managed to get a law reducing the road speed maximum in cities from 60 kilometers an hour to 50 kilometers an hour 2 years ago, it's not enforced. And most of our urban roads are actually highways in disguise. We've measured, we have a really major, in fact, the intersection where most of the demonstrations and so on occurs in Santiago is the busiest intersection in the country. And I've had students measure speeds of 70 kilometers an hour going through an intersection that has 21 different lanes and thousands of people crossing every hour.
Speaking of, Julian is asking about, we have seen a big modal shift in different parts of the world. And we had these new bicycle lanes being placed all over. And we saw people coming and using them. For example, in Paris, this happened right away. And now we see it's day and night. We see like the number of cyclists were in some streets and we see them today. It's amazing about that. So do you think this is going to stick around? And how equitable are these being distributed in the cities as well?
2 really good questions. I think they're going to stick around because they've been a long time coming. And there's a lot of suppressed demand that is finally receiving a really solid response. Paris has been working on this for many, many years, and most of the European cities have as well. How equitable it is really a problem. And you can see this in the studies with bike share, because bike share is a wonderful kind of intermediate bridge between people who maybe know how to cycle, but don't usually do it to get around, but they can try it at a very low cost, and they don't have to keep a bicycle in their apartment. They can just go out and use it. And again, I'm sorry, Ahmed, but I really love Montreal. Unlike Montreal, where you actually see a lot of bike share stations in residential neighborhoods, if you go around Latin America, you'll find them clustered around transport hubs, which is a great idea, and in mixed commercial residential, but they don't really serve the low-income neighborhoods on the periphery where they're most needed and where they could really contribute significantly to equity. And that said, I'd like to mention two really interesting exceptions for anyone concerned about this. Fortaleza and Brazil, they addressed this challenge by creating not one bike share system, but 4 different kinds of systems to make sure that different classes of people could have access to bike share. So very low income workers have access to a system where they can take the bike to their home, the bike stays there overnight, and then they go back. And New Orleans, in a more developed country in some ways, they've done it largely through citizen participation in the planning and the development of the system, so that tourists or visitors, when we go, we pay a higher fee. It's still a reasonable fee, but it's a higher fee. But local people have a much lower fee, but they've also had training and participation to get them involved in the system. And they've had very good results. There's studies published on their website and so on.
Okay, there was a question here by Costa. I can't see it again. Yeah, here it is. Okay, it is interesting to me that the models of cycling cities you used when we talk Copenhagen or Amsterdam seem to be located in countries that are also models of other sorts of social progress. So is it a vicious circle? You know, how can, like, because you are socially progressive, so you will be moving in the cycling and we keep going and getting better, but the other ones, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think it's true?
I love that you said that, because I started thinking about that a few years ago. And I was thinking, isn't this a funny coincidence that 2 of the most democratic and most participatory countries in the world are actually the most cycling inclusive? So then I started thinking, well, is it a chicken or an egg? Did they advance on cycling because they're more democratic, or did they become more democratic as they integrated cycling? And I think it would be a great topic for an amazing study in a book. But if you look at what is available now, it does seem that they co-constituted each other. So that people in the 70s in the Netherlands, for example, were extremely upset about the kinds of road fatalities and disabilities that we're seeing here in Latin America. And they organized and they created these movements, and they took over local city governments and the provincial governments and so on. And if you look 30 or 40 years later, I worked a lot with the Dutch and was trained by the Dutch a few years back. So I had a lot of opportunities to really look at them, and also the Danish as well. And yeah, if you look, you'd see activists moving into city planning positions. Well, of course, an activist who moves into a city planning position is much more able to dialogue and to have a democratic, horizontal, egalitarian relationship than someone who's been put there as a kind of a reified engineer who thinks they know everything, and why should they ever get on a bike to see if their cycleways work? So that said, and this is not a study that I'm doing, but I do watch these kind of phenomena. And I would say that, yes, the cycling movement in Chile and in other countries of Latin America is playing a role in democratizing not only our city governments, but our societies. They're creating new kinds of relationships between people. And I don't want to idealize, because there's a lot of bad stuff goes on in civil society. But at the net level, what you see is They're learning to interact with local authorities. They're learning to interact with politicians. They're learning to influence laws. And when they do that, they make lawmakers more permeable to democratic proposals or citizen proposals. And of course, what's happening in Chile now is it's not just cyclists or walkers or public transport users. There's all these different social movements, pro-pension, pro-public healthcare, etc., that have followed the same route for the past 30 years, and we haven't got anywhere. I used to think co-optation was a terrible thing when I lived in Canada and I was in the student movement and all that. And now what I'm seeing is that co-optation, I mean, there are limits and there are rules and ethics to be regarded here. I don't want to be too extreme, but co-optation is part of the way that the institutions in a country pick up new ideas and integrate new people and become more inclusive in that sense. And to the degree that your political system does that well and that your institutions do that well, you're going to thrive and be more resilient in these times. So my observations are that yes, there's a relationship and it's a virtuous circle, or it can be a virtuous circle.
I have two related questions, a little bit about social and cultural and psychological barriers to biking and sustainable modes. And you talk about Montreal, and what I'm seeing on the ground here, there's a lot of backlash going in, because first it was that the mayor the city wasn't moving quickly on putting the bicycle lanes and for the sanitary for COVID. And then when they put stuff, now everybody's fighting with them. Many people are fighting with them to get them down, and the car thing. At the same time, the other related question is, you had personal experience with campaigning and outreaching and public outreaching in fighting some of these kind of pushbacks. So what are your suggestions of or prescription that people can follow in here, or suggestions that because right now there's a push against that, and you saw that push in Chile and you helped in pushing it back a little bit. It pushed, but so there's a lot of tension going on. So what would you, because your hands are actually in the thing, so you know what works and what doesn't work in outreach and campaigns like that.
Okay, so these questions are really related to what we were just exchanging on. And so my other area of expertise as a researcher is civil society, so citizen organizations and systems that involve them in governance and put them to work achieving positive change. So this is probably the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity for dealing with bike-lash, as it's called. I love that term. No translation for it, so I have to make the best of it when I'm talking in English. So what you really need is to start these conversations way before you're implementing the infrastructure on the road, right? People always feel proprietary toward the roads and the sidewalks in their neighborhood, and they always feel violated, or at least the victims of the objects of some kind of aggression, if someone comes along and decides to change the system that's been going along for so long. And this comes into force really strongly with automobility. And that's why, even though it's a very well-known concept, I like to start from there. Because yeah, you figure all these low-income Chileans who maybe have started out being street vendors, and they've managed to buy a secondhand truck and started moving things around and making a living from that. And then they have their car. And now you turn around and you say, no, forget your car. We're not going to let it go on. That's really not a good way to have a productive conversation. So there is an art and a science to civil society participation and involvement in these decisions. And I'll just give one really concrete example. Between 2006 and 2010 in Chile, we orchestrated with advisors from the Netherlands, also an NGO, But we got the regional government involved and the National Transport Ministry and all the civil society organizations involved. And we did a round table for cycle inclusion. And in that round table, we had people from the arts community, people from the environment, people from local neighborhood associations. We had a real diversity of people. And what it did in 3 years was create a complete about face. Cycling went from a very unpopular, peripheral, marginal, very stigmatized way to get around in the city to being like the best thing on wheels was to have a bike. And you could go into the malls and there would be bikes hanging from the roofs, and the expositions were always had bikes and so on. And the reason for that, and we doubled modal share, we quadrupled the cycle facilities in the metropolitan region, generated a national policy that has then been applied in cities all over Chile, was really, really powerful. It was 3 years of really carefully designed conversation across diversity. We didn't just talk to cyclists, we talked to older people who are worried about cyclists on the sidewalks and being run over and potentially breaking a hip and then dying. And we were talking with people concerned about sports, etc. And so a few years later, a very, very dynamic, very positive regional governor tried to do something similar, but he only talked to cyclists. And the result was that we ended sliding into a lot more of those debates, but also above all, initiatives stopped. They didn't really progress the way you would have hoped. And in the case of Santiago Center, where we had all these award-winning changes for walkability and cyclability and all that, something similar, they did a really good job of doing a plan and applying the plan in a very short period of time. But at the same time, there wasn't enough buy-in from the neighbors. And you really can't afford to skip that step if you're talking about pretty paradigmatic change.
Unfortunately, we are at the hour. Always talking to you is lovely and enjoyable. And I wish we would have like another 2 hours to talk with you, because the questions are really rich and I'll be emailing them to you.
Oh,
so
thank
thank you so much, Lake. And next week we will be going to the neighbor country. We'll be talking about Buenos Aires. So for those who are interested in attending with us, thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you in the next seminars. Thanks, Lake.
Thank you.